Alright, so now we're going to have a look at what happens after sperm and egg can actually come together, so once a zygote can form. So we start to call these post-zygotic mechanisms. So if we are able to get a zygote forming, which is literally the fusion of a sperm and egg cell, so that's sort of first origin or point of a new organism, basically there are other mechanisms that will allow for that species to not be successful. And so we can say that those species or subspecies may actually grow and survive, but there are mechanisms that won't allow them to actually then further interbreed. And so the first one we look at is hybrid inviability. And so what happens is, whilst they might actually contain all of the genetics necessary for them to be able to go on and reproduce with other organisms, so we would say that they wouldn't be able to reach adulthood. If that was the case, basically, then we might have further pre-zygotic mechanisms that could come into place, and they might be excluded from being able to reproduce. Generally, though, what we tend to see with hybrid inviability is that the individuals are actually weak, and so they do not compete for the resources in the same way as the previous organisms or the other species, the subspecies that exist there. And so because they're not genetically suited as well to the environment, basically they're going to die off. And then that's when natural selection comes into place. And so they can't actually then contribute to changing the gene pool later down the track. So that's not to say that it cannot happen, it's to say that that is a realistic thing. So hybrid inviability refers to being weak, essentially, or maybe potentially that there are other pre-zygotic mechanisms that then occur afterwards if that organism was to reach adulthood that will prevent it from being able to then contribute to the gene pool in a population. Hybrid sterility, one that's also very common, is that basically the organism doesn't have the gametes that are able to go on and contribute. So it might be able to grow to adulthood, but then when it goes to interbreed, it's basically infertile. And so if it's infertile, then its genes cannot be passed on to successive organisms. Therefore, the actual hybrid organism that was produced is a one-off and will not continue to go on and thrive or survive. And so we can see here some examples of some hybrid organisms. So we know that there are ways that we can create subspecies or new species, but these ones actually are just individuals and don't go on to contribute to their gene pool. Alright, and now we look at, once we've covered what makes a species, we look at how do we get genetic variation within species. And so we're going to focus in a lot on what happens in sexually reproducing species. We've talked a little bit about why we can't have a lot of genetic variation in asexually reproducing species, with the only source being mutation. But we see that there are heaps of mechanisms here where we can get genetic variation in sexually reproducing species. And so essentially mutations, what we need to know and remember and understand is that they actually occur. With every time we do mitosis or meiosis, what happens is there might be misprints or misreads, there might be reasons where we get a genetic change, so in the DNA sequence. And so if a mutation occurs in a somatic cell, so any cells in our body that are not sex, so sperm or egg cells, basically what can happen is if that goes unregulated, and if that happens in those what are they called again? I can't remember the name. The growth cells, what happens is they can become cancerous, and if they go unregulated, i.e. the cell mechanisms that process cell apoptosis don't work, we can develop cancer. But what you need to know is if a mutation occurs in a somatic cell, so let's say as my skin cells are replicating, that mutation is only localized to here. It's not a mutation that exists all over my body. However, if we get a mutation in a gamete cell, so a sex or a sperm or egg cell, which is a sex cell, what happens is that mutation will be passed on to the offspring if it is not one that is sort of removed completely. So if that particular cell that has the mutation is able to then fertilize an egg, or vice versa, that is part of the egg that is fertilized by the sperm, then what we're going to get is we're going to get that mutation going on and existing in every somatic cell in the new organism.